In his book, Ray Dalio claims we're seeing an archetypical big shift in the world order that will affect everyone in all countries. So should we be scared of the next upcoming economic crisis? Are we truly witnessing the beginning of the major shift and the new world order? Let's find out! Hi, this is Veronica, and today we will take a look at the principles for dealing with the changing world order, which is an ambitious book written by the legendary billionaire and iconic thinker Ray Dalio. In his book, he's warning us that we're about to witness an archetypical big shift in the world, and times will be radically different from what we know. And the upcoming events will affect everyone in all countries in profound ways. Current events like internal disorder, financial crisis, political polarization, wealth gaps, money printing, and internal and external conflicts have all taken place before, and if we want to be safe, we need to learn how to deal with them. This is why he believes we need to prepare as investors for a challenging period by understanding that you need to study history to find out what could happen in the future, because history repeats itself. Ray Dalio's study. Ray Dalio's recent study recognizes the significance of human evolution, the archetypical big cycle which influences the world order, and the power of world-dominating empires. He claims that the world's most powerful empires followed the big cycle pattern for over 500 years, and every time they did, it was the beginning of changing the world order. Often there had happened an external conflict between countries, which led the leading empire to decline and led a new empire to take over the leading position. Currently, it's the US that has been leading, especially since World War II. Why is evolution the fundamental force? As he claims, the only permanent force in the universe is evolution, which means moving toward improvement through learning and adaptation. And the more we learn about the causes of events, the more we can adapt in the future as humankind. Thanks to evolution, we have reached productivity, which has improved the world's total health, power, and living standards. Ray Dalio backs the statement up with the estimated data over the last 500 years in relation to estimated output, real GDP per capita, and global life expectancy at birth. These are probably the two most widely agreed upon measures of human well-being. You can see that output per person appears to be steadily improving, accelerating from the 19th century, when the slope up became steeper, reflecting faster productivity gains. So this shift from slower productivity gains to faster productivity gains was primarily due to improvements in broad learning and the conversion of that learning into productivity. Why does evolution create the new world order? To be able to examine the world order that changed throughout centuries, Dalio researched and compared all times and declines of all major empires and their currencies over the last 500 years. Focusing on empires like the US Empire, the British Empire, and the Dutch Empire, and taking into consideration less financially dominant empires of Germany, France, Japan, China, and India. What he noticed about all of these empires is that great empires typically lasted for around 250 years, with big economic, debt, and political cycles, within them lasting about 50 to 100 years. His observations are the following. China was dominant for centuries, outcompeting Europe economically, but it entered a steep decline starting in the 18th century. The Netherlands, a relatively small country, became the world's reserve currency empire in the 16th century. The United Kingdom followed a similar path, peaking in the 18th century. The United States rose to become the world's superpower over the last 150 years, with an emphasis on the starting point during and after World War II. And what can come across controversial is that the United States is in a relative decline while China is rising again, which can imply the beginning of a new big cycle and a world order change in favor of China. That said, in order to truly analyze and measure the power of an empire, Dalio came up with 8 metrics to help determine that. Education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, the share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. You can see how rising education leads to increased innovation and technology, which leads to an increased share of world trade and military strength. stronger economic output, the building of the world's leading financial center, and the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. We can come to the conclusion that for an extended period most of these factors stayed strong together, and then they declined in a similar order. This observation leads Dalio to the conclusion that we can recognize the significance of the cyclical interrelated move up and down the big cycle, since an empire's strengths and weaknesses are mutually reinforcing. How the big cycle impacts the power of an empire. The archetypical big cycle. The archetypical big cycle consists of rises and declines that happen in three phases: the rise, the top, and the decline. Each phase is characterized by different attributes, which create and affect the leading empire's internal and external events. You can see that the rise is defined by strong leadership, inventiveness, education, competitiveness, and strong markets and financial centers. The top phase is characterized by lower productivity, losing competitiveness, and wealth gaps, and as a result, the decline phase is represented by large debts, printing money, loss of reserve currency, and polarized society and politics, which lead to crisis. To paint the picture, Dalio converts most of his measures into color to make it more visible, so that when combined, these forces define which stage of the cycle a country is in. The greener the color, the more force works in a country's favor, and on the contrary, the less green or even red, the less favorably the force works in a country. The more the forces combine, the more powerful the impact they have on a country's stability. Now let's stop for a second and analyze which attributes precisely affect an empire and the consequences of them in every phase of the big cycle. The rise. The rise is a prosperous building and development period that comes right after the new order. The country is fundamentally strong and becomes more productive because there are relatively low levels of indebtedness, relatively small wealth, values, and political gaps between people, strong character, civility, and work ethic development, innovating and inventing new technologies, people working effectively together to produce prosperity, good education and infrastructure, strong leadership, system development to incentivize and empower those who have the ability to make or get wealth, developing capital markets like stock and bond markets, a large number of people converting their savings into investments to fund innovation and development, global trade while protecting trade routes with powerful military strength, a new world's empire developing into the world's leading financial center and leading reserve currency, which enables the country to borrow more and at lower rates than other countries, because others want to lend in the leading currency. A peaceful world order that is guided by one or more dominant world powers. Ray Dalio brings up the consequences of all of the greatest empires that developed the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the capital of their times. He talks about Amsterdam as the world's financial center when the Dutch were prominent, London when the British were on top, New York as now, and currently China is quickly developing its own financial center in Shanghai. Ultimately, if an empire follows all of these steps, it inevitably reaches the next stage of the big cycle, which is the top. In the top phase, the country sustains the success that fostered its rise. But embedded in the rewards of the success are the seeds of decline. What it means is that over time obligations pile up, breaking down the self-reinforcing circumstances that fuel the rise. People in a rich and powerful country earn more, which makes them more expensive and less competitive than people in other countries willing to work for less. The leading country's competitiveness decreases as other countries naturally copy the methods and technologies of the leading power. As people in the leading country become richer, they tend to not work as hard and enjoy more leisure and seek less economically productive things in life. Values change across generations, from those who had to fight for wealth and power to those who inherited and are more vulnerable to challenges. People get used to doing well, so they increasingly bet on the good times, continuing and borrowing money, which leads to financial bubbles. When capitalist systems rise, financial gains are uneven, so the wealth gap increases in society. Rich people influence the political system to their advantage and give greater privileges to their children, like better education, causing gaps in values. As long as the living standards of most people are rising, these gaps and resentments don't transform into conflict. The leading country has the privilege of having a reserve currency, which makes it borrow more money and dig itself deeper into debt. The country begins to borrow excessively, which contributes to the country building up large debts with foreign lenders. Borrowing more money boosts spending power over the short term, but it weakens the country's financial health, the currency, and it finances domestic overconsumption in the long run. The richer countries go into debt by borrowing from poorer countries to save more. The empire begins to fall when it begins to run out of new lenders. Those holding their currency begin to look to sell and get out rather than buy, save, lend, and get in. Ray Dalio mentions here that this is what started in the US in the 1980s, when it had a per capita income 40 times that of China's and started borrowing money from the Chinese, who wanted to save in dollars because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. And this leads to the last phase, the decline. The last phase is the decline phase, typically coming from internal economic weakness combined with internal fighting. When debts become large and there is an economic downturn, the empire can no longer borrow the money needed to pay off debts, so it prints more new money. When a country thus decides to print new money, it devalues the currency and raises inflation. This leads to worse financial and economic conditions, which increase wealth, values, and political gaps. It creates internal conflict between the rich and poor, and between different religious and ethnic groups. In times like this, political extremism and anti-capitalist phase increase, so the elites are blamed for the internal problems. Typically, taxes on the rich rise, and when the rich fear for their wealth and well-being, they move their assets and currencies to places they feel safer in. Outflows reduce the country's tax revenue, which leads to a self-reinforcing hollowing out process. Some people start to panic, which puts their assets in danger. Turbulent conditions undermine productivity, which leads to challenging times for democracy, because it fails to control the anarchy when opposition leaders speak up and demand more of the economic resources which are already shrinking rapidly. This is a simple path to internal conflict or civil war. You may ask, are those patterns powerful enough to actually cause a change in the world order? They are powerful enough when the forces that produce internal disorder and instability align with the external challenge that can change the entire world order. For this to happen, the decline phase needs to tick a few more boxes for the leading country to fall. When there is a rising great power that is capable of challenging the existing great power, there is a rising risk of a great international conflict. Typically, the rising international opponent will seek to exploit this domestic weakness, which carries the potential risk of a military conflict. Defending oneself against a foreign rival requires great military spending, which has to occur even as domestic economic conditions are weakening, and the leading country whose power is declining usually cannot afford it. As challenges appear, the leading empire is faced with the difficult choice of fighting or retreating. Fighting and losing is the worst, but retreating is bad as well because it allows the opposition to progress and shows weakness to other countries. Wars are expensive and they produce unnecessary tectonic shifts that realign the world order to the new reality of wealth and power. When those countries that hold the reserve currency and debt of the declining empire lose faith and sell them, that marks the country's fall from grace and end of its big cycle. Changes to the world order. Ray Dalio claims that the big cycle of an empire's rise and decline typically looks like what we've just learned. The bad period of destruction and restructuring via depression, revolution, war, and tearing down and building up the new system typically takes about 10 to 20 years. They are represented by the shadowed areas and are followed by more extended periods of peace and prosperity, in which smart people work harmoniously together and no country wants to fight the world power because it's too strong. These peaceful periods last for about 40 to 80 years. Dalio brings up the history, when the Dutch Empire gave way to the British Empire and when the British Empire gave way to the US Empire. Most, if not all of the following events took place: debt crisis, internal revolution, external war, big currency breakdown, new domestic and world order. Dalio points out that the last period of destroying and restructuring happened between 1930 and 1945, which eventually led to the period of building and creation of the New World Order. This involved the creation of a new global monetary system and a US-dominated system of world governance. Alright, but why is that? The New World Order was a natural consequence of the US being the richest country, having the 2/3 of the world's gold stock, being the dominant economic power which then accounted for half of the world's production, and the strongest military, which then had a monopoly for the nuclear weapons, and the strongest and most innovative conventional armed forces. The future. Taking into consideration that most empires inevitably decline and that when the book was published it's been over 75 years since the last New World Order has assumed power, Ray Dalio points out that we can anticipate the New World Order taking place soon, in our lifetime. What's controversial is that in his book, Ray Dalio shares data about the US appearing to be a declining empire, and what makes it even more controversial is a prediction that China is aspiring to be the next superpower. Although China does tick some boxes of the first phases of the big cycle, because it has become a superpower in international trade, a manufacturing and production world leader, and over the years Chinese influence over other countries has been significantly expanding, it's difficult to predict the future since there are multiple internal and external factors and economic and financial indicators which should be taken into consideration. Moreover, not all of the factors in the US analysis are included in China analysis in order to state with confidence that this is what the future holds. On that note, what we have been witnessing recently, the world pandemic or international conflicts leading to wars, should indicate to expect the unexpected, and anytime you make an investment, take multiple domestic and external factors into account. That said, this book is highly ambitious and very complex and paints a big picture of what the world looked like and how it was shaped to become what we know today. I recommend you read this book and tell us your thoughts on the changing world order. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what kind of videos you'd like to see next. To get leverage working for you, you need to persuade your counterpart that they have something real to lose if the deal falls through. There are 3 types of leverage. Positive, which is the ability to give someone what they want. Negative, the ability to hurt someone. And normative, using your counterpart's norms to bring them around.